Good morning, Good Samaritans. It's good to see all of you here today. The title of this sermon that I'm giving today is We Find Our Courage in Jesus. We find our courage in Jesus. Today is the fifth Sunday in the season of Lent. And next Sunday, as you heard, is Palm Sunday. And we start out there with the blessing of the palms, and we process in here. And it's symbolic of when we remember Jesus triumphantly riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, in contrast to Pilate, who rides into town on a magnificent stallion. And then in Holy Week, the most important week of the Christian year, we remember the last week of the life of Jesus. But I'm getting just a bit ahead of myself. In his classic novel, The Robe, Lloyd C. Douglas has a character named Marcellus who became enamored with Jesus. And during his time in Judea, Marcellus often wrote to his fiancée, Diana, back in Rome, and he told her about Jesus and his teachings, and he told her about his miracles, and then he told her of the crucifixion. He was one of the soldiers that gambled for the robe, and he was actually the one who got the robe. And this story, fictional, but this story in the robe is about what happens to him. But he tells Diana about the crucifixion of Jesus and about the resurrection. And finally, he informed her that he had decided to become a disciple of the one called Jesus, the Christ. And in her response to him, Diana said, "What I feared most is that this might affect you." It's a beautiful story. Let it remain so. We don't have to do anything about it, do we? We find our courage in Jesus. Bad things happen when good people do nothing. Palm Sunday and Good Friday, the triumph and the tragedy. Jesus, was welcome in the New Testament society as long as he fed people and healed people and preached and taught quietly in the hinterlands. As long as that was the case, he posed no threat to anyone. An irritation maybe, but not a threat to either political or religious establishments. Yet as his ministry progressed, he chose to go to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the political and religious cultural center of the Hebrew nation. It was the center of New Testament life. The Hebrew culture, both political and religious, was based on the Old Covenant that you heard about in the first reading today. We call that the Old Testament. A covenant is a contract between two parties, binding them both to each other. And the Old Covenant was a contract between God and the Israelites. And as with most covenants, it was sealed by blood. Recall what it meant to be blood brothers. Two people would cut their hand and clasp them together and bind their wrists together, and they would share each other's blood, and they were called blood brothers. And that was the symbol or the sign of this bond of friendship or the unity, and that blood sanctified it. So blood in the Old Testament was considered life. It came from God, and it was used to sanctify and to give life to the covenants. It was even used in ordaining the new high priests. Blood made things and people holy. And blood was even a sign of atonement, setting things right. So in a covenant with God, the covenant was sanctified in blood. And the covenant with Abraham was sealed in blood by circumcision, which God said to Abraham, "I will be your God, and you shall be my people." This was the establishment of the Israelite community. And then Moses was asked by God to lead the Israelites out of the land of Goshen. Blood was used as a sign of the Israelites so that death would pass them over. Remember that story? They put blood on the door, and the angel of death would pass over all those. And during the time spent in Sinai, they were building a community of Israel. And it was during this time in the desert that the 10 Commandments were given to Moses. And after Moses received the commandments, they were shared with the people. And then God asked Moses to bring 70 elders upon the mountaintop with him. And an animal sacrifice was made, and the blood was splashed on the altar. And after the commandments were read to the people and they agreed, the blood was splashed on them. So the 10 Commandments were a covenant between God and his people, blood sanctifying that relationship. Now, to us in the 21st century today, that sounds gross, I know. But it did not then. It was the holiest of holies. And they tried to live into those commandments, and the numbers grew overwhelmingly. So by the time the Torah was in place, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which had become known as the Law, and within those 5 books, there were 613 laws in place. Think about that. That's a lot of law. I mean, I think I'd be afraid to move for fear of breaking a law. But it does make me think a little bit about our society today when you think about the number of laws we had, say, in the early 1900s versus the number of laws we have today. So we, as I mentioned, we often call the Old Covenant the Old Testament. And we read an Old Testament lesson, you get a psalm, you get a New Testament lesson, and then you get a gospel during our worship service today. And many times there's a theme that goes across all of them. And I think you can hear the theme today. So this testament is something that serves for us as a sign or evidence of a fact or even an event or even a witness. We hear of it most often in the relation to a person's last will and testament. And we call the Bible the New Covenant or the New Testament. So it was into this culture, political and religious world, that was sanctified and dominated by the Old Covenant that Jesus came. And he came because the Old Covenant wasn't working. He came into Jerusalem in triumph on Sunday. We remember that by calling it Palm Sunday. On Monday, the day Jesus overthrew the money changers in the temple. The next day, he taught in the temple and said that the temple would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. We're not told much about what happened on Wednesday. Maybe he rested. It was already common knowledge he had raised Lazarus from the dead and visited with him just a few days before arriving into town. So he arrived into town a marked man. And then in short, he took on the whole establishment. Political, religious, and cultural all at once. He knew they would not understand or buy into what he was saying or doing. He had predicted their misunderstanding. He had even predicted his own arrest and his own death. On Thursday, he chose to eat the Passover dinner with his disciples in Jerusalem, the city that killed its prophets. At a meal, he taught the disciples that to be a leader, you must be as one who serves. Jesus taught by example. He washed the feet of the disciples. Then he gave them some bread and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then after supper, he took the cup, blessed it, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink this, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Whenever you drink it, drink this in remembrance of me." So a new covenant was made, bound by blood, the blood of the Messiah. A new covenant in his blood with new terms. It created a new people, a people born again, a new Israel born from above, a new Jerusalem, a city built on a hill, a new reality of the Messiah. His ministry given to us was to continue the work that he had done in the world, to continue the work that Christ had started. A new beacon of the love of God in the world. A new beacon of the love of God in the world. So that's where we can find our courage. When things seem distraught, when things seem unbearable, when things seem unfair, when things don't seem to be going right, things don't seem to be going our way, we find our courage in Jesus. But then it's also our responsibility to take action, to do. Jesus was sent. He was sent here with a ministry, and we are sent. We are sent with a ministry. We find our courage in Jesus. Bad things happen when good people do nothing. Palm Sunday and Good Friday. The triumph and the tragedy. Amen.